Hello. I hope everybody's staying healthy and safe. And since we haven't met in a while, I just needed to video some more chapters because I only had a few of them videoed. So this is a new one. This is chapter 16, and we're going to talk about protists and bacteria today. The chapter is entitled "The Origin of Microbial Life," and microbial life are those that are listed as or thought of as being microscopic. And so we have two kingdoms that we're going to talk about in two different domains. And so the first domain is, or first two domains are archaea and bacteria. And just a little refresher, because we haven't met in a while. Bacteria reproduce asexually by a process called binary fission. Remember binary fission? That was a question, bonus question on your last test. This time on your test it will be a multiple choice question. So you need to make sure you know that it's binary fission. It's not fusion, it's fission, all right? Like you're trying to catch fish, all right? Bacteria and archaea both have one DNA molecule, and it is circular, and so it allows them, allows them to mutate a little quicker than other things, other organisms that have multiple chromosomes or DNA molecules. So the first domain is domain archaea. These are ancient type of bacteria. Arch means ancient, all right, so they're old. And so the kingdom that we're talking about is Archaebacteria. And they're primitive. They're usually found in areas that have extreme environments. And there are three types of Archaebacteria. One are called methanogens, and they make methane. Methane is a gas. It's colorless, but it's combustible. And so these organisms, as a byproduct of their metabolism and cellular respiration, fermentation, they produce methane gas. All right, and these can be found in several different places. They can live in swamps, sewage, animal guts, other anaerobic conditions. In swamps, if conditions are right and there's enough static electricity in the air, some of this methane that is being produced in the bottom of the swamp mud, right, can actually bubble out of through the water and be released. And if enough static electricity is there, it will actually ignite spontaneously. It's called St. Elmo's fire. Now, I've never seen it before, and I don't know where they got the movie titled as St. Elmo's Fire, because it has nothing to do with swamp gas. But that is a result from these methane makers, methanogens. The second group are halophiles. Halo means salt. Philic is loving, so these are salt lovers. I'm a halophile. And they live in brackish ponds, salt lakes like the Great Salt Lake in Utah, near hydrothermal vents in the ocean, areas where the crust in the bottom of the ocean is very close to the mantle, and in these areas a lot of heat and gases come into the salt water, And around these vents, you'll find these halophiles as well. In the last one, are extreme thermophiles. These are heat lovers, thermo, heat, philic, love, right? They live in highly acidic soils, hot springs, geysers, and coal mine spoil, usually very colorful, yellows, purples, pinks, yellow, orange, and these are going to be really common if you go to Yellowstone and visit geysers and hot springs there. You'll see all these methanogens encircling these geysers and springs. And so here's a picture of a geyser, and around it you can see orange and yellow. Those are those extreme thermophilic archaebacteria, and that's in Yellowstone. In the domain bacteria, the kingdom that we're looking at here is eubacteria. EU means true, so these are the true bacteria that you think of when you think of bacteria. And there are three major types, and these types are based on whether they use light to make their own food, or if they can't make their own food, they have to use food from other sources, right? So photoautotroph, photo means light, autotroph means that they make their own food. So these are photosynthetic bacteria. Then there are chemoheterotrophs. The chemo part means that it does not need light, but they do make their own food. And then chemoheterotrophs, these are bacteria that don't use light, and they need other sources of food other than themselves. They can't produce their own food. So we're going to take a look at each of these groups. The first was the autotrophic eubacteria. And again, they're photosynthetic, and sometimes they're called cyanobacteria or blue-green algae, with the quotes around algae because they're not really algae, they're bacteria. But they are found in aerobic conditions. They're photosynthetic, like we said. They take sunlight and make their own food. They live in fresh water, sometimes on damp soil, rocks, and splash zones of creeks and waterfalls and things like that. They form chains and mats in the water that most of the time they float, but some of them are attached to surfaces. And even though they are a mat or a chain, each little cell is its own autonomous, own self-feeding organism. All right, so they're unicellular, one-celled. Some can convert atmospheric nitrogen. Nitrogen is extremely important to plants. It's a nutrient that plants have to have in order to survive, and they can take atmospheric nitrogen, which is not usable to most plants, and convert that into ammonia. And ammonia is very readily available, usable by plants. So that gives them a little bit of a competitive advantage over other algae and other bacteria, because they can take this nitrogen and convert it into a form that they can use to survive. They use this thing called a heterocyst to help them do that. These particular bacteria can release toxins. Their cell walls themselves have chemical molecules that are can cause reaction to skin and to nasal cavity and eyes. All right, so there's certain chemical chemical molecules in the cell walls of these things that can cause irritation. And then some of them can release neurotoxins and hepatotoxins. Hepatotoxins are liver toxins. And so every year in the late summer, early fall, when conditions are right, these algae start to multiply in great numbers. We call that a bloom. And when that bloom occurs, those cells can release these toxins, and they're powerful enough to kill livestock, goats, sheep, cattle, even dogs. And so during that time of year, if you see a pond or a lake that has this electric green sheen on the top of this kind of a scummy surface, you can kind of run your hand through it, and the water separates. The cells separate so you can see the water. It's not cottony or not something that you can really hold and kind of rub in your hand. It kind of falls apart. Then that might be one of those cyanobacteria blooms or blue-green algae blooms, and you'll probably want to try to restrict any animals from drinking in that water. Some of our lakes and rivers do have blue-green algal blooms during this time as well, and we have in the past tested for these toxins, and it can cause people to have flu-like symptoms if they recreate in it. And so the best advice is if it's got a neon green, and you'll see it here in a second, I've got a picture of it, scum surface on it, you really don't want to swim in it anyway, all right? And so just avoid those areas where there's high concentrations of these cells, and most of the time you'll be fine, right? So here is a picture of a duck in one of those blue-green algal blooms, and you can see where the duck is gone. So as it's kind of swam through the bloom, it's left a trail. It separated the cells, and they're just so you don't really have this thick constituency of the cells. It's really sort of like a powdery type of consistency. So those are photoautotrophic. Chemoautotrophic eubacteria are those that make their own food, but they use other sources other than light. They don't photosynthesize. They'll use carbon dioxide and some inorganic compound to produce their food. They also are some that can fix nitrogen, and they are found in the soil, and they are important in enriching soil with nitrogen, replenishing nitrogen in the soil. These are called, ones that do this are called nitrifying bacteria. Those are examples of these chemoautotrophic bacteria. And then there are chemoheterotrophic bacteria. These are bacteria that they don't use light, and they can't make their own food. So they have to get their food from other organisms, and these are going to be decomposers or consumers. In the boreal forest, the coniferous forests up north and out west, where most of the trees are conifers, bacteria are the major decomposer in water and soil. You get closer, where we live, where we have mostly deciduous trees that lose their leaves, then fungi become the most important decomposer in those areas. So there's several different examples of chemoheterotrophic bacteria. One is pseudomonads. These are important decomposers in soil. Another one is called lactobacillus. Lacto means milk. Bacillus is, as we're going to find out, is the shape of a particular type of bacteria. And lactobacillus is important in dairy products. We talked about fermentation, lactic acid fermentation. These bacteria are important in making yogurt and buttermilk, etc. Actinomycetes are sort of fungal-like bacteria. They decompose stuff in the soil, and if you take some dirt, and you smell it, that dirt smell, that actually is a byproduct of these decomposers, these actinomycetes, that are breaking down organic material. And as they do, they release this thing called geosmin, this compound. And this compound makes the dirt smell. So when you pick up some dirt and you smell it, say, oh, that's good dirt. Farmers like that, then that smell, the dirt smell, is called geosmin. It's produced by these actinomycetes. But back in the day, when we started developing antibiotics, one of those antibiotics was developed from actinomycetes, and it was produced and called actinomycin. Right? It's an old time, probably weak antibiotic now. Sure, most bacteria are resistant to it, but it was used back 30, 40 years ago. E. coli, Escherichia coli, is an intestinal bacteria found in mammals and birds. All right, it aids in digestion. If you didn't have E. coli in your digestive system, then you would not be able to digest a lot of things. However, if we get other animal, mammal, or bird E. coli in our system, our flora doesn't like that other E. coli strain, and will cause an infection, and this can cause diarrhea, very high temperatures, and you don't want E. coli poisoning. It's extremely tough on people, especially children and older people, or people with low immune systems. And so when making steak, they're cutting muscle tissue from the cow. It usually doesn't come in contact with digestive organs, etc. So the chances of getting E. coli in a steak are fairly low. But when making ground beef, they take parts from all over that are left over and grind them together. And if some of that had come in contact with some animal waste, then that bacteria can get rolled into the hamburger, ground beef, and then can lay dormant in there as these spore-like things. Right? If you don't cook your meat well enough, and those spores are released, then you can get E. coli poisoning. And so the bottom line is, especially ground beef, is to cook your food. So when you cook, especially if you're cooking it for older people or kids, you want to make sure that your hamburgers are done well, or well done. And so make sure that when you press on the hamburger patty, that the fluid that comes out of it is clear. It can't be brownish. It can't have little solid looking parts to it, it needs to be clear. All right. Once you get it to that point, you've heated the inside up enough to where it has killed all of the potential bacteria that are there. Spirochetes are these corkscrew shaped bacteria that in the soil can fix nitrogen, but some types of spirochetes are actually pathogens, which we'll talk about here in a second. Clostridium. Clostridium is the genus of a bacteria that lives in the soil. It is the causative agent, Clostridium tetani, of tetanus, and Clostridium botulinum, which is food poisoning, right? And so Clostridium tetani produces toxins that will make muscles spasm, and to the point where they don't contract or release. And so when people get tetanus, it's also called lockjaw, because the muscles in the face and the jaw, they just tense up and they don't release. And so tetanus is roughly 97% fatal. However, we do have inoculations for that. Tetanus is something that you need to make sure your boosters are kept up on a timely basis. All right. If you cut your hand, if you step on a nail, something like that outside, you will need to make sure that you have these boosters all up to date. Now, they definitely last for 5 years. All right. It said 10 years is when you need to go and get another booster. Between that 5 and 10 year span, if you do have a nice cut outside, barbed wire, whatever, or if you step on a rusty nail or something, it probably is a good idea, especially from the 7 to 10 year range, to go ahead and get another booster. You need to talk to your doctor about it, but it's a good idea to make sure that you don't get it. You can take your booster after your accident, and it still will work, but you don't want to die from tetanus, and it's not a very pleasant way to die. And so you need to make sure that you keep up with your inoculations, your boosters for that. Clostridium botulinum is, like I said, food poisoning, and ounce for ounce, the Clostridium botulinum toxin is the most toxic natural substance on the face of the earth. Ounce for ounce, naturally made toxin. But you know what we do with it? We shoot it in our face. Yes, Clostridium botulinum toxin is what we use in Botox. I don't know who decided to try it out because it's so toxic, but it has been used to get rid of wrinkles and lines out of people's faces. I don't know if there's enough data, long-term data, to know if there's any side effects that could harm people. If I were you, I would enjoy your lines and wrinkles and stay away from it. I wouldn't do that if I were you all. Now, where food poisoning comes in is if since it's a soil bacteria, they you grow beans, let's say, and the rain hits the ground around the beans, and the dirt gets pushed up or plopped up onto the beans, right? So when you when you pull the beans out, you they've got dirt on them, right? And so if you take those beans and you take them and you're going to can them, for instance, you wash them off, wash them real good, and then you can them, and then you seal them in the can. If that seal is not completely kept, if it's not completely sealed, then these bacteria with these spores could possibly be in there, and then when you take out those beans and you start to eat them, they might actually have bacteria there that could cause you, give you food poisoning. That's why when you go to the store and they say don't get dented cans, because that can the seal might be broken because of that dent, and that could cause you food poisoning. Borrelia is the causative agent of Lyme's disease. In Kentucky, we don't have the true Lyme's disease, but we have several different kinds that are have the same type of symptoms, right? The true Lyme's disease was found in northern United States from the deer tick. We have several different types of deer ticks. The one that usually has some spread of Lyme's disease is called the Lone Star tick. It's a brown tick with a white spot on the back, and so if you definitely see one of them, you don't want it to embed in you, because it could bring in Borrelia. Borrelia at the site of the bite will turn red, a rash, kind of red rash, and then it will form like rings around that, like a bullseye. If you have this kind of rash developing on your body, you need to go to the doctor quickly so that they can do as much antibiotics as they can to stop it, because it can reside in joints and cause joint problems for years to come. It's just not a very good thing to have. And so if you do have a tick that's embedded, do not take your fingers and pull it out, because you could be injecting some of the Borrelia into your wound. So what you need to do is get a pair of tweezers, we call them forceps, get as close to the skin as possible, and try to pull out the head when you pull it out. All right, and so if you are pulling ticks out of dogs or whatever, you need to make sure when you finish to wash your hands really well, because you might get the bacteria on your hands as well. So those are chemoheterotrophic bacteria. Then let's talk a little bit about shapes of cells, of bacterial cells. Some of them are elongate, like a oval shaped, and those we call bacilli. Bacilli is plural. Bacillus is a single, and we talk about lactobacillus, right? Lacto milk bacillus, a rod-shaped bacteria. And then there are spherical cells, and these are called cocci or coccus.